Picture this: a quiet monastery at dawn, the air thick with incense and murmured prayers. Just beyond its walls, the clatter of coins and the bustle of market stalls grow louder by the day. This wasn't just a clash of noise, it was a collision of worlds. For centuries, Europe's soul hung in the balance, torn between the spiritual purity of monks and the relentless ambition of merchants. But here's the twist: this wasn't a war of bloodshed. It was a battle of beliefs, a silent struggle that reshaped everything from art to economics, from faith to the very idea of what it meant to live a meaningful life. And the echoes of that conflict, they're still with us today. Think about the last time you weighed a moral dilemma against practical needs, maybe choosing between a higher-paying job and one that aligns with your values. That tension you felt, it's the same one that gripped medieval Europe. Monks saw wealth as a distraction from salvation, while merchants believed commerce could uplift society. Neither side was entirely right or wrong, but their friction sparked innovations that changed the world. Universities, banking, even the concept of timekeeping, all emerged from this ideological tug of war. So why does this matter now? Because the questions they grappled with are still ours. How do we balance material success with spiritual fulfillment? Can progress and piety coexist? This story isn't just about the past, it's a mirror held up to our own lives. The monks and merchants of medieval Europe didn't just argue over money or prayer, they were wrestling with the essence of human purpose. And as we trace their journey, you'll start to see their fingerprints everywhere, in the way we work, the way we spend, even the way we measure our own worth. By the end of this exploration, you won't just understand history, you'll see the invisible threads connecting their world to ours, ready to uncover how a battle fought with quills and ledgers changed everything. Let's begin. To understand how monks became such towering figures in medieval Europe, we need to step inside their cloisters, not just as places of prayer, but as engines of transformation. Take the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. On the surface, it was a simple guide for communal living, prayer, work, study, but beneath that humility lay a revolutionary blueprint. Benedict's insistence on self-sufficiency turned monasteries into pioneers of agriculture, with monks draining swamps, breeding livestock, and perfecting crop rotations centuries before these became widespread. Their lands weren't just feeding the brothers, they were feeding entire regions, making monasteries indispensable to survival. Then there was the quiet revolution of their scriptoriums. While most of Europe was illiterate, monks preserved and copied ancient texts from Greek philosophy to Roman law. Imagine a single illuminated manuscript, each page taking months of labor, each stroke of ink a bridge between the ancient world and the future. These weren't just books, they were time capsules ensuring knowledge survived chaos. And when Charlemagne needed administrators for his empire, where did he turn? To monks, the only ones who could read, write, and keep records. Suddenly, these spiritual men held the keys to governance. But here's the irony: their vow of poverty often collided with their growing influence. Monasteries like Cluny amassed vast donations, land, treasures, even entire villages from nobles seeking spiritual favor. The more they owned, the more they resembled the wealthy elites they'd sworn to reject. Critics whispered, how could men who renounced the world control so much of it? Yet without this wealth, the monasteries couldn't have funded hospitals, schools, or the very arts that defined medieval culture. It was a paradox that would haunt them and set the stage for the merchants' rise, because while monks built stability, merchants thrived on change, and in that tension, Europe found its future. While monks shaped Europe from their cloisters, another force was rising in the shadow of cathedral spires: the merchants. These weren't just peddlers hawking wares, they were revolutionaries with pack animals and ledgers. As trade routes stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, a new world was taking shape. Picture a bustling market in 12th century Champagne, where Flemish wool met Italian silks, where Arabic numerals danced alongside Roman coins. This wasn't mere commerce, it was the birth of a new language, one spoken in profits, contracts, and the clink of silver. What made merchants so dangerous to the old order? They played by different rules. In a feudal system where land equaled power, they built fortunes on something fleeting: money. A lord's wealth was tied to acres of soil, but a merchant's could multiply overnight with a single shrewd deal. And unlike monks bound to their abbeys, merchants were citizens of nowhere and everywhere: Venetians trading with Mongols, Germans banking for popes. Their loyalty wasn't to a lord or a diocese, but to opportunity. The church watched this rise with alarm. Here were men who prized calculation over contemplation, who saw usury, charging interest, not as sin but as strategy. Medieval theologians had long condemned profit seeking as greed, yet merchants argued their work fueled progress. Look at the Lombards of northern Italy, who turned banking into an art. Their ledgers didn't just track coins, they invented concepts like credit, transforming wealth from something static into something that could grow. Towns became their battlegrounds. Walls that once protected monasteries now encircled thriving communes like Bruges and Florence, where merchants formed guilds and challenged noble privileges. In these urban hubs, clock towers rose not to mark prayer hours but to pace workdays. Time itself was being redefined, measured in productivity rather than psalms. Even the architecture shifted. Where cathedrals pointed heavenward, merchant halls sprawled earthward, their vaulted ceilings sheltering warehouses instead of relics. Yet for all their disruption, merchants weren't rebels without a cause. Their greatest legacy might be how they bridged worlds. When the Cistercian monks needed to sell wool across Europe, it was merchants who built the networks. When princes needed funds for crusades, it was Italian bankers who provided the coins. The very parchment monks scribed was often financed by trader wealth. Two forces that seemed opposite, spirit and commerce, were becoming inextricably linked. This tension birthed something extraordinary, a Europe where faith and finance coexisted, however uneasily. The merchant's counting table and the monk's altar stood as twin pillars of a changing civilization. And in that duality lay the seeds of the modern world, where value could be measured in both celestial grace and earthly gold. The clash between spiritual and material wealth wasn't just philosophical, it cut to the core of how medieval people saw their place in the world. Imagine a 15th century craftsman kneeling in confession, admitting he'd raised prices after a competitor's death. His priest warns of hellfire for exploiting others, while across town, a merchants' guild debates fair pricing as essential for economic growth. Both men genuinely believed they were doing right, one by divine law, the other by market logic. This tension played out in astonishing ways. Take the medieval church's ban on usury, the charging of interest. To monks, profiting from loans was exploitation, a sin against charity. But merchants saw it differently. Without interest, how could risks be measured? How could trade expand? The solution emerged in creative loopholes. Italian bankers began calling interest penalties for late payment, while Jewish moneylenders exempt from Christian laws became crucial financiers, though often scapegoated. The system adapted, but the moral unease lingered. Even saints got entangled in this debate. Francis of Assisi famously stripped naked in public, renouncing his merchant father's wealth to embrace holy poverty. Yet within decades of his death, Franciscan friars were managing vast charitable networks funded by merchant donations. The irony was palpable. The order preaching simplicity now relied on complex financial instruments to feed the poor. Meanwhile, merchants weren't immune to spiritual angst. Many built hospitals, funded altar pieces, or left fortunes to monasteries, not just for prestige, but from genuine fear their souls might be weighed down by gold. The Medici family epitomized this duality. As Europe's most powerful bankers, they commissioned Botticelli's divine masterpieces while calculating interest down to the last florin. Their chapels glimmered with gold leaf, a visual paradox, material wealth used to celebrate immaterial grace. This struggle reshaped everyday life too. Medieval towns passed sumptuary laws dictating who could wear silk or fur, trying to enforce social order against merchant upstarts. But how could you stop a cloth merchant's wife from dressing like nobility when her husband's wealth rivaled a duke's? The laws were often ignored, revealing a truth. Money was becoming a new measure of status, as potent as birthright. Yet for all their differences, monks and merchants shared an unexpected common ground. Both were builders of civilization. Monks preserved knowledge, merchants spread it through trade routes. Monasteries provided stability, towns fostered innovation. The tension between them wasn't destructive friction, but creative conflict, like two hands shaping clay on a potter's wheel, one steadying while the other stretched the form. Out of their opposition came something neither could have created alone, a world where faith and commerce, though never fully at peace, learned to walk the same road. The Church's condemnation of usury wasn't just a rule. It was a moral earthquake shaking the foundations of medieval commerce. Picture a Venetian trader in the 13th century, hands stained with ink from tallying debts, knowing every coin of interest he charged risked his very soul. To the Church, lending at interest was theft, taking something from nothing while the poor suffered. But merchants saw it differently. Without credit, how could a spice caravan cross deserts, or a shipbuilder secure timber before his vessel was commissioned? The gap between doctrine and necessity forced society into impossible contortions. Enter the Lombards of northern Italy, masters of creative accounting. They couldn't openly charge interest, so they called it a gift or voluntary donation from grateful borrowers. Contracts grew elaborate. A loan might officially bear no interest, but include a hefty penalty clause for late payment that just happened to match the going rate. Even the Church itself became entangled. When popes needed funds for crusades, they quietly borrowed from Tuscan bankers, turning a blind eye to the math behind the loans. The real twist came with Jewish moneylenders, exempt from Christian laws yet often barred from other professions. They became Europe's unofficial bankers. Kings and bishops borrowed from them while publicly denouncing the practice. In England, records show Jewish lenders charging 20 to 30% interest, not from greed, but because rulers taxed them mercilessly. When debts grew too large, monarchs like Edward I simply expelled Jewish communities and erased their ledgers. It was a brutal cycle, scapegoats for a system no one would openly endorse yet couldn't live without. Yet this tension sparked unexpected progress. The Church's ban forced merchants to invent new financial tools. Bills of exchange let traders pay in one currency and collect in another, with exchange rates quietly hiding interest. Insurance emerged as a way to share risk rather than profit from misfortune. Even double-entry bookkeeping, the foundation of modern accounting, grew from the need to track these complex transactions transparently. The deepest irony, these workarounds made commerce more ethical, not less. By forcing lenders to justify every fee, the usury debate birthed concepts like fair pricing and risk assessment. When the Medici Bank opened branches across Europe, Their ledgers didn't just track coins, they measured trust. A merchant's reputation became as valuable as his gold, because in a world where contracts were hidden but consequences eternal, honesty had earthly and heavenly rewards. This struggle reveals a profound truth about medieval Europe. Its greatest innovations emerged from contradiction. The Church's ideals couldn't stop capitalism's rise, but they did shape its conscience. What began as a prohibition became a conversation, one that still echoes today every time we debate fair wages, responsible lending, or the true cost of profit. By the 12th century, the very monasteries that had once embodied poverty now glittered with gold, their altars adorned with jewels, their storehouses overflowing with grain. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux took one look at Cluny Abbey's lavish architecture and thundered, "What profit is there in these ridiculous monsters?" To him, carved capitals and gilded chalices weren't acts of devotion but distractions from prayer. His words struck a nerve because they exposed an uncomfortable truth. The spiritual was slipping into the material. Enter the Cistercians, Bernard's answer to this crisis. They built their abbeys in remote valleys far from towns and temptations. Their churches had bare stone walls, their habits undyed wool, no gold, no art, no excess. Even their liturgy was stripped back to pure chant, as if trying to scrape away centuries of accumulated compromise. At first glance, it worked. Cistercian monasteries became powerhouses of agriculture, their sheep farms funding expansion across Europe. But here's the twist, their very success undermined their ideals. By the 13th century, Cistercian wool was so prized in Flemish markets that their austerity had accidentally birthed an economic empire. The pattern repeated with the Franciscans a century later. Francis of Assisi had preached radical poverty, his followers owning nothing, not even shoes. Yet within decades, Franciscan friars were managing vast networks of donations, their begging bowls replaced by account books. Townspeople loved them for their humility, but that popularity came at a cost. The more alms they received, the more they needed administrators to handle the wealth. Even saints couldn't escape the math. Why this endless cycle? Because monasteries weren't just spiritual enclaves, they were mirrors of human nature. A monk kneeling on a cold chapel floor might crave the warmth of a stained glass window. A community feeding the poor needed land to grow that food. Every act of charity, every manuscript copied, required resources. The harsher truth was that Europe was changing around them. As towns grew, so did the demand for monastic services, schools, hospitals, arbitration in disputes. You couldn't run a hospital on prayers alone. The backlash wasn't just from reformers like Bernard. Ordinary people noticed when abbots lived like princes while peasants starved. In England, the satirical poem Piers Plowman mocked fat monks who had their heaven here on earth. Yet when reformers succeeded, their victories were often temporary. The Carthusians, perhaps the strictest order, never wavered in their solitude, but their very rigidity limited their influence. Meanwhile, the Benedictines, despite their compromises, kept education and culture alive through chaos. This tug of war reveals something profound about medieval society. The dream of purity always collided with the messiness of survival. Even as monks denounced wealth, their communities became the banks, the landlords, the social safety nets of their age. Their struggle wasn't hypocrisy, it was the human condition. To be in the world but not of it proved far harder than anyone imagined. And in that struggle, they unknowingly laid the groundwork for modernity. The same tension between ideals and practicality would later shape everything from capitalism to the welfare state. The monks' real legacy wasn't their failures or reforms, but their stubborn insistence that the spiritual and material worlds had to find some way to coexist. Guild halls began dotting the skyline of medieval cities, not as grand as cathedrals, but pulsing with a new kind of energy. Inside, candlelight flickered across ledgers and wax seals as merchants swore oaths not to a king or bishop, but to each other. These weren't just trade associations, they were fortresses of solidarity in a world still ruled by swords and scripture. When the weavers of Ghent or the goldsmiths of Paris banded together, they weren't just haggling over wool prices, they were rewriting the rules of power. The genius of guilds lay in their duality. By day, they enforced quality standards measuring cloth by the ell, testing silver for purity, but by night they functioned as shadow governments. Take the Charter of London in the 12th century. In exchange for loans to the crown, merchants won the right to elect their own mayor. Similar deals unfolded from Cologne to Florence, where guildsmen bargained with emperors and popes like equals. Their weapon wasn't the sword, but the ledger, proving that debts could bind rulers tighter than oaths of fealty. Yet guilds also understood the power of piety. Walk into any medieval guild hall, and you'd find altars alongside account books. The Fishmongers' Guild of London funded a chapel where prayers rose for drowned sailors. The Drapers of Bruges commissioned altarpieces depicting Saint Nicholas, patron of pawnbrokers. This wasn't just lip service to church doctrine, it was shrewd diplomacy. By endowing hospitals or funding cathedral windows, guilds softened their image as profit-seekers. A merchant might charge interest, but if he also fed the poor, who could call him greedy? The tension between commerce and conscience played out in guild statutes. The Frankfurt spice traders fined members who diluted saffron with marigold petals, not just to protect profits, but because fraud stains the soul. Venetian glassmakers guarded their techniques with religious fervor, yet shared them freely during famines to keep fellow citizens employed. Even their feasts walked this line. Lavish banquets displayed wealth, but leftovers went to the destitute at the city gates. Guild's most revolutionary act, though, was inventing social mobility. In feudal Europe, a blacksmith's son was bound to the forge until guilds began accepting apprentices based on skill, not birth. The stories read like medieval fairy tales. A butcher's boy rises to guild master. His daughter marries a knight's son with her dowry of guild profits. Suddenly, the old nobility faced rivals whose crests weren't inherited, but earned, emblazoned with hammers and looms instead of lions and crosses. Monks watched this rise with uneasy fascination. Some, like the Franciscans, partnered with guilds to distribute alms. Others preached against the vanity of guild parades where silk-clad merchants outshone knights. But the truth was undeniable. Guilds had cracked open a door. Monasteries once guarded the door to knowledge. Where monks hoarded manuscripts in scriptoriums, guilds built public schools. The arithmetic needed to calculate interest became the math that mapped the stars. The contracts that bound merchants evolved into civic laws. By the 14th century, the balance had tipped. When the Hanseatic League, a super guild of German traders, could field armies and levy taxes, it was clear urban autonomy wasn't just an exception anymore. It was the future. The age when monasteries alone held the keys to learning and order had ended, not with a war cry, but with the clink of coins in a guild master's chest and the whispered deals that turned profit into power. The streets of Assisi in the early 13th century were a living paradox. Wealthy merchants draped in imported silks, stepping over beggars coughing in the gutters. Into this divide stepped a young man named Giovanni, later called Francis, who did something unthinkable. He stripped off his fine clothes in the town square, handing them back to his textile merchant father as he declared loyalty only to Lady Poverty. This wasn't just theater. Francis's radical vow to own nothing, not even a spare tunic, struck at the heart of medieval Europe's crisis of conscience. While Benedictine abbots dined on silver plates and Cistercians became wool magnates, Francis proposed a third way. What if holiness meant walking barefoot through the marketplace rather than retreating behind cloister walls? His followers, the Franciscan friars, became a spectacle in city streets. Unlike monks bound to their abbeys, these fools for Christ slept in haylofts, mended lepers' sores, and preached in vulgar Latin that even the illiterate could grasp. Their genius lay in inversion. Where traditional monasteries accumulated wealth to serve God, Franciscans proved their faith by having nothing to give but their hands and voices. A Florentine banker watching a friar patch his roof for free might scoff, until he realized that same friar wouldn't charge interest when loaning grain during a famine. The message was clear: true spiritual authority didn't need gilded reliquaries. It could wear patched rags and still command respect. Merchants found themselves unexpectedly drawn to these holy beggars. Here was a form of piety that didn't condemn commerce outright but challenged its excesses. When a Sienese moneylender funded a Franciscan hospice, he wasn't just buying indulgences. He was investing in a new vision where profit and compassion might coexist. Even the friars' economic practices broke molds. They invented the Montes Pietotis charitable pawnshops, offering small loans at minimal interest just to cover operating costs. It was usury with a halo, proving finance could serve the poor rather than prey on them. Yet the Franciscan Experiment teetered on contradictions. As their popularity grew, so did donations find vestments for mass stone chapels to replace their twig huts. By 1280, Pope Nicholas IV, a former Franciscan himself, had to issue a desperate decree. Yes, the order could accept property, but only if held in trust by the Church. The loophole was telling. Even Francis's purest vision couldn't escape the medieval reality. To scale their mission, they needed systems, and systems required money. The deeper legacy, though, wasn't in their failures but in their flexibility. While monks and merchants debated in abstractions, Franciscans worked the fault lines between worlds. They translated gospel stories into marketplace parables, turning fishmongers' scales into symbols of divine justice. When they kept records of alms received, those humble ledgers evolved into some of Europe's first charitable accounting systems. Most strikingly, they proved spirituality could thrive in the noise and stench of cities, not as a scold against commerce, but as its conscience. By the 14th century, Franciscans were advising kings on tax reform and bankers on ethical investing. Their greatest miracle wasn't living without coin. It was making coin serve something beyond itself. In that alchemy, where gold touched by prayer might still be gold, but somehow different lay the fragile hope that Europe's soul didn't have to choose between sanctuary and marketplace. It just might find a way to inhabit both. The commercial revolution didn't arrive with fanfares or coronations. It crept in on the creaking wheels of merchant carts and the scratching of quills on parchment. By the 12th century, something extraordinary was unfolding. A Flemish weaver could sell cloth in Constantinople using credit from an Italian banker, while a monk in Cluny fretted over the morality of such transactions. This wasn't just about new goods or coins. It was a complete rewiring of how value moved, how trust was built, even how time itself was measured. Take double-entry bookkeeping, invented by merchants in Lombardy. At first glance, it was just columns of numbers, debits on the left, credits on the right. But hidden in those ledgers was a philosophical bombshell. For monks, wealth was a static thing to be hoarded or given away. But double-entry accounting revealed money as a flow, a relationship. When a banker recorded both a loan and the promise of repayment, he wasn't just tracking coins, he was mapping the future. Suddenly, time itself became something you could quantify: interest rates measuring the distance between now and tomorrow. Insurance blossomed from the same ingenuity. Venetian shipowners pooling risks weren't just dodging bankruptcy, they were inventing collective security. A single storm could ruin a trader, but spread across 100 voyages, the risk became manageable. The church called it gambling, but merchants saw it as solidarity, a secular version of the monastic vow to care for the weak. Yet for all its brilliance, the commercial revolution had a dark edge. When French peasants starved because grain was shipped to Flanders for higher profits, or when entire towns collapsed under debt, critics howled. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas wrestled with a haunting question: could a system built on profit ever be moral? His compromise, allowing just prices and condemning exploitation, satisfied no one. Merchants grumbled at restrictions, monks warned it was too lenient. The revolution's true legacy lay in its contradictions. The same Italian banks financing Crusades also funded cathedrals. The Hanseatic League, a trading empire, enforced standards so strict that a baker selling undersized loaves faced public flogging, yet their courts settled disputes faster than feudal lords. Even the Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe, accelerated change. With laborers scarce, serfs demanded wages, and merchants adapted faster than land-bound nobles. What finally emerged wasn't a triumph of greed over piety, but a messy fusion. The commercial revolution didn't kill spiritual values, it forced them to evolve. When a merchant donated to build a hospital, was it vanity or virtue? When a monk invested in a vineyard to feed the poor, was it wisdom or worldliness? The answer, as Europe was discovering, wasn't either-or. Progress and soul could coexist, but the balance would always be uneasy, always contested, and forever human. The Black Death swept through Europe like a scythe, cutting down rich and poor alike, monks in their cloisters, merchants in their counting houses, peasants in their fields. By the time the pestilence receded in the 1350s, entire monasteries stood empty, their choirs silenced. Markets once teeming with traders were ghost towns. Yet from this devastation emerged something unexpected, a world tilted toward the future. Where the church saw divine punishment, merchants saw possibility. And in that gap between despair and opportunity, the balance of power shifted forever. Consider the labor shortages. With up to half of Europe's population dead, survivors suddenly held leverage. A French peasant who once owed 3 days a week to his lord's fields could now demand wages, or walk to a neighboring village offering better terms. Guilds, desperate for craftsmen, relaxed apprenticeship rules, letting talent trump birthright. Even serfdom began to crumble as lords, unable to force compliance, bargained instead of commanded. This wasn't just economic change, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, ordinary people grasped their own worth, not as souls awaiting salvation, but as hands that could negotiate. Monks faced a darker reckoning. Their infirmaries had overflowed with the dying, their prayers had gone unanswered. When the plague spared neither pious nor sinner, faith itself wavered. Some monasteries doubled down on austerity, flagellants whipping themselves in public penance. Others, like the Carthusians, retreated further into isolation. But the larger crisis was financial. With so many patrons dead, donations dried up. Monasteries that had once rivaled nobles in wealth now sold relics to feed their remaining brothers. The very institutions that had anchored medieval life found themselves adrift. Merchants, meanwhile, turned chaos into calculus. In Venice, grain prices spiked 600%, but savvy traders who'd stockpiled early reaped fortunes. The Medici Bank expanded by buying up debts of the deceased at pennies on the florin. Even tragedy became tradable. Insurers adjusted premiums based on port cities' death tolls. What looked like opportunism was also innovation. The old feudal order, built on land and loyalty, couldn't adapt, but a merchant's world, fluid, pragmatic, rooted in contracts, could bend without breaking. The deepest change, though, was in how people saw authority. When bishops died alongside beggars, the church's claim to divine favor rang hollow. When merchants rebuilt supply chains faster than lords could rally knights, power revealed its new face, not in castles but in warehouses. A Florentine wool trader might not command armies, but if his loans funded a king's wars, who truly ruled? Yet this wasn't a straightforward triumph of commerce over cloisters. The plague's randomness bred a peculiar duality. Survivors flocked to both revivalist preachers and fortune-tellers. They donated to monasteries while investing in merchant ventures. The same person might wear a pilgrim's badge next to a silk gown, hedging bets between this world and the next. In the end, the Black Death didn't resolve the tension between monks and merchants, it amplified it. The church, though wounded, would launch grand new cathedrals to reclaim spiritual sway. Merchants, though ascendant, would keep commissioning altarpieces to soothe their souls. What the plague truly did was strip away illusions. It showed that survival, whether of bodies, institutions, or ideas, depended not on divine right or tradition, but on adaptability. And in that harsh light, Europe began its slow, uneven march toward modernity. Look up at the vaulted ceilings of a Gothic cathedral. Those soaring ribs of stone seem to pull heaven itself down to earth. But glance closer, and you'll spot the mason's mark beside the merchant's coat of arms, the biblical scenes framed by stained glass windows paid for with wool profits. This was the paradox of medieval art. The holiest spaces were also ledgers of earthly ambition. When merchants funded cathedrals like Chartres or Rheims, they weren't just buying salvation, they were carving their place in history. The gargoyles leering from the rooftops, they weren't just warding off demons, they were silent witnesses to a cultural revolution where commerce and piety shared the same sacred space. Monks, meanwhile, waged their own aesthetic rebellion. Walk into a Cistercian abbey like Fontenay, and the contrast is stark. No gold, no frescoes, just clean lines and bare stone. Their art wasn't in decoration, but in absence. A single plain cross spoke louder than a jeweled reliquary because it forced the viewer to confront the void where worldly beauty should be. Yet even here, compromise crept in. The Cistercians' famed sheep raised for their austere wool became so prized that their monasteries inadvertently bankrolled the very luxury trades they condemned. The monk weaving a simple cloak might never know his wool would end up dyed Tyrian purple for some merchant's wife. The real battleground, though, was in the details. Take the medieval altarpiece. A monastic version might show Christ's crucifixion on unadorned wood, emphasizing suffering and sacrifice, but a merchant-funded altarpiece. Look for the donors themselves kneeling in the corner, their richly embroidered robes painted with lapis lazuli so expensive it rivaled gold. These weren't just devotional objects, they were arguments in pigment and varnish. When the Van Eyck brothers painted the Ghent altarpiece with its meticulous fabrics and gleaming jewels, they were making a theological claim that God's creation included, and perhaps blessed, the material world. Architecture told the same story. Cathedral spires competed with Guildhall towers for dominance of the skyline. In Florence, the Wool Merchants Guild commissioned Brunelleschi's dome, a feat of engineering so audacious it seemed to defy gravity. Meanwhile, monasteries like Monte Cassino clung to Romanesque simplicity, their thick walls a metaphor for spiritual fortification against the world's temptations. Yet even these walls couldn't hold back change. When the abbot of Cluny needed repairs after a fire, guess who lent the funds? Lombard bankers, who discreetly added their symbols to the rebuilt cloisters. So who won the cultural war? The answer lies in a single telling object, the medieval hourglass. Monks used them to mark the canonical hours, their sands measuring time as a countdown to eternity. Merchants turned them sideways, the same glass now timing ship departures and market bells. Both visions endured, not as victor and vanquished, but as intertwined strands in Europe's identity. The stones of those cathedrals whisper the truth. The medieval soul wasn't split between God and gold, but stretched across the tension between them, and in that stretching it found its fullest expression. Imagine a dusty workshop in Mainz around 1450, where Johannes Gutenberg dipped his metal letters into ink for the first time. That simple act, pressing type onto paper, didn't just create a book, it lit a fuse under medieval Europe's entire intellectual order. For centuries, monks had been the gatekeepers of knowledge, their scriptoriums producing manuscripts at a glacial pace. A single Bible could take a scribe 3 years. Now Gutenberg's press could print 300 pages in a day. The implications were explosive. Suddenly, the church's tight control over what people read, and by extension, what they thought, began to crumble like old parchment. Merchants saw the potential instantly. Where monks prized painstaking accuracy, printers valued speed and volume. A Venetian trader could now ship crates of books up the Rhine, their contents ranging from Cicero's speeches to manuals on double-entry bookkeeping. The cost, a printed book in 1500 was about 1/5 the price of a handwritten one. Literacy, once a luxury for clerics and nobles, trickled down to shopkeepers and ship captains. And with it came dangerous ideas like vernacular Bibles that let laypeople interpret scripture without priests, or pamphlets questioning indulgences. The Church had long argued that interpreting texts required scholarly training. Now, any merchant's apprentice with basic Latin could draw his own conclusions. Monks reacted with a mix of horror and ingenuity. Some Benedictine abbeys bought presses to churn out missals and prayer books, trying to co-opt the technology. Others, like the Carthusians, retreated further into silence, refusing to let printed words corrupt their meditation. But the tide was unstoppable. When Erasmus's satires became bestsellers, printed in Basel by merchants who cared more about profit than piety, it marked a turning point. Knowledge was no longer a sacred relic to be guarded. It was a commodity bought and sold like Flemish wool. The real battleground was language itself. Monks wrote in Latin, the tongue of God and scholars, but printers catered to the masses, publishing in German, French, and Italian. Luther's 95 Theses spread like wildfire, not because they were revolutionary. Many theologians had criticized indulgences before, but because they were printed in the vernacular and hawked at fairs alongside spices and tools. A monk might spend years crafting a perfect Latin sermon. A pamphlet could undercut it in days with a catchy rhyme. Yet for all the disruption, the press also forged unexpected alliances. Wealthy merchants funded beautiful printed editions of religious texts, blending piety with prestige. Printers like Aldus Manutius in Venice worked with humanist scholars to preserve Greek classics, creating pocket-sized books that fit in a traveling merchant's satchel. Even the Church adapted, using printed indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica, a twist of irony since those very indulgences had sparked Luther's revolt. The deeper legacy of Gutenberg's invention wasn't just in spreading ideas, but in changing how people trusted them. A handwritten manuscript bore the aura of sacred tradition. A printed book carried the whiff of the marketplace, where truth competed with other wares. In that shift, from cloistered certainty to the clamor of public debate, lay the seeds of everything from the scientific revolution to modern democracy. The press didn't just break the Church's monopoly on knowledge. It turned every reader into a potential heretic, every bookshelf into a battleground for Europe's soul. Deep in the trading towns of southern France, the Cathars whispered a dangerous idea. What if the Church itself had become corrupted by wealth? these weren't just heretics railing against doctrine. They were weavers, cobblers, and merchants who saw a glaring contradiction. How could Rome preach poverty while its bishops wore silks and dined on peacock? The Cathar's answer was radical. They rejected church hierarchy entirely, believing true faith required no grand cathedrals or gold chalices. Their rituals were stark, a simple laying on of hands in dimly lit homes, their scriptures translated into the vernacular so even a wool merchant's wife could read them. To the establishment, this wasn't just heresy, it was an existential threat, because the Cathars didn't emerge in remote forests, but in bustling commercial centers like Toulouse and Albi, places where merchant guilds already chafed under church taxes and noble privileges. The Waldensians took it further. Founded by a Lyon merchant named Valdez, they preached that anyone, not just priests, could interpret scripture. Imagine the shock when illiterate farmers started debating theology after hearing Waldensian preachers in the marketplace. Even more alarming to Rome, these movements didn't just critique church wealth, they mirrored merchant culture. Cathar perfecti, like successful traders, traveled light, owning nothing but the clothes they wore. Waldensians kept meticulous records of their networks, much like trade guilds tracking shipments. Their heresy wasn't just spiritual, it was a rebellion against the medieval world's entire power structure. The Church's response was brutal but revealing. When the Albigensian Crusade crushed the Cathars in the 13th century, it wasn't just about doctrine. The papal legate allegedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Behind that infamous order lay a cold calculation. Heresy thrived where commerce loosened feudal bonds. In Carcassonne, Cathar sympathizers included cloth merchants who resented tithes cutting into profits. In Milan, Waldensian ideas spread among bankers tired of ecclesiastical interference. The Inquisition's meticulous records, lists of burned books, confessions extracted under torture read like a ledger of fear. Each execution was a warning. Challenge the economic order, and you challenge heaven itself. Yet the suppression backfired in unexpected ways. Persecuted Waldensians fled to Alpine valleys, where they became adept smugglers hiding Bibles alongside bolts of smuggled silk. Their survival tactics mirrored the merchant networks they'd once been part of, proving that ideas could travel even when people couldn't. Meanwhile, the Cathar heartlands, once pillaged by crusaders, later became hubs for the Renaissance's free-thinking merchants. The irony was thick. The very forces that destroyed these movements inadvertently fertilized the soil for future revolts, from Luther's Reformation to Enlightenment critiques of church power. The deeper pattern here, religious dissent and economic discontent, were never truly separate. When a Flemish merchant heard a Waldensian preach that usury laws were hypocritical, or when a Cathar weaver declared that labor was holier than priestly pomp, they weren't just debating theology, they were articulating a new vision of society. One where value came from work, not birthright, where spiritual authority could be earned, not bought. The Church wasn't wrong to fear these ideas. They didn't just threaten its coffers, they hinted at a world where salvation, like trade, might one day be open to all. The bustling docks of Lübeck in the 14th century buzzed with a language all its own, not Latin or German, but the clatter of goods being weighed, the shouts of deals struck in a dozen dialects. Here, under the shadow of red brick warehouses, the Hanseatic League wasn't just trading fish and timber, it was rewriting the rules of power. This loose alliance of merchant guilds from Hamburg to Riga to Novgorod operated like a medieval superpower, yet it answered to no king or pope. Its currency wasn't crowns or mitres, but trust stamped into wax seals and ledger entries. When a Hanseatic cog sailed into London or Bergen, it carried more than cargo, it carried the quiet revolution of commerce as sovereignty. What made the League extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its structure. Unlike feudal lords bound by oaths, Hanseatic merchants connected through mutual interest. If a Prussian grain dealer cheated a Flemish buyer, word spread through the contours trading posts from Bruges to the Black Sea, blacklisting the offender across hundreds of ports. No need for knights or excommunication. The market itself enforced order. Their statutes read like a merchant's 10 commandments: fixed weights and measures, standardized contracts, even rules for debt arbitration. In an age when kings routinely debased coins, the League's insistence on fair dealing built something rarer than gold reliability. Politically, the League played a delicate game. They bribed Danish kings to lower tolls, loaned silver to cash-strapped monarchs, and when threatened, they could embargo entire nations. In 1368, when the Danish king seized Hanseatic ships, the League's response was merciless. They blockaded Scandinavia for 7 years, starving Denmark into submission until its king signed the Treaty of Stralsund, effectively handing control of the Sound, the gateway to the Baltic, to merchants. No pope or emperor had ever granted such power to commoners. Culturally, the League became a conduit for ideas as much as goods. When Hanseatic traders brought Flemish paintings into Estonia or Russian furs into Flanders, they didn't just move products, they blended aesthetics. The stepped gables of Lübeck's merchant houses inspired architecture from Stockholm to Tallinn. Their almanacs, tracking tides and fairs, circulated alongside recipes combining Baltic herring with Mediterranean spices. Even their crimes innovated. The first recorded case of insider trading happened in 1429, when a Hanseatic clerk leaked grain shipment dates to his brother. Yet the League's greatest legacy was invisible: the birth of economic interdependence. A Hanseatic merchant in Reval, modern Tallinn, might sell German wool to Russians, use the profits to buy Novgorod's wax for Flanders, then invest in Icelandic fish, all while never leaving his counting house. This wasn't just trade, it was a web of connections making war between neighbors costlier than peace. When the Teutonic Knights attacked Polish ports, Hanseatic cities refused to finance either side, not out of neutrality, but because conflict bad for business. The irony, the League's downfall came from the very individualism it unleashed. As Dutch and English traders copied their methods, Hanseatic cities began competing against each other. By the 16th century, the world had outgrown their model, but the lesson endured. Commerce could bend kingdoms, shape cultures, even tame the chaos of medieval politics. The League proved that gold, when pooled and wielded wisely, could build something more enduring than castles, a system where the promise of profit kept the peace better than any knight's sword. By the 15th century, the once revered monasteries found themselves caught in a storm of their own making. Wealth that had once funded hospitals and illuminated manuscripts now lined the pockets of absentee abbots who lived like princes. In England, visitors to Glastonbury Abbey reported silver forks on the abbot's table, and his private zoo of exotic birds hardly the image of humble devotion. Meanwhile, peasant families starved on lands these same monasteries controlled. The disconnect wasn't just hypocrisy, it was a fatal misreading of the times. As towns grew richer and more literate, people began questioning why they should tithe to institutions that seemed more interested in collecting rents than saving souls. The rot went deeper than luxury. Some monasteries had become revolving doors for second sons of nobility, young men with no vocation, installed as abbots to control lucrative church lands. At St. Gall in Switzerland, records show monks drinking and hunting when they should have been at prayer. Even the Benedictines, once models of discipline, faced accusations of forging charters to claim more territory. When reformers like Jan Hus railed against Christ's bride bedecked in jewels, his words resonated because they matched what villagers saw: cloisters that looked less like spiritual retreats and more like poorly run feudal estates. Yet the tragedy wasn't just moral, it was strategic. Monasteries failed to recognize how Europe's information landscape was changing. While merchants embraced printing presses to spread contracts and news, most monastic libraries still guarded knowledge like dragons hoarding gold. When a German scholar requested access to a rare manuscript in 1420, the abbot refused, fearing secular contamination. Meanwhile, merchant-funded schools taught accounting and languages skills that promised upward mobility. The message was clear: monasteries offered prayers for the afterlife, but towns delivered prosperity here and now. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter: real estate. As the Black Death emptied monasteries, many leased their lands to merchants or nobles. Over generations, these temporary arrangements became permanent. By 1500, a third of French monastic property was effectively controlled by laymen who cared little for the original spiritual mission. When the Reformation erupted, reformers like Henry VIII didn't just confiscate church lands, they capitalized on centuries of quiet resentment from tenants tired of monastic landlords. Could things have been different? Perhaps if monasteries had shared their agricultural innovations more widely, or if they'd trained monks as teachers rather than just scribes. The Franciscans showed glimpses of adaptability, running urban soup kitchens, mediating labor disputes, but their influence waned as papal politics diluted their radical poverty. In the end, the monks' greatest mistake wasn't wealth or corruption, but rigidity. They clung to a medieval worldview while Europe raced toward modernity. Their decline mirrored a seismic shift in values, from collective salvation to individual agency, from heavenly rewards to earthly opportunities. When Erasmus joked that monks measured holiness by the inches of their hoods, he captured the absurdity of an institution that had lost touch. Yet the irony is profound: the very monasteries that preserved classical learning inadvertently nurtured the humanist ideas that would make them obsolete. Like their own illuminated manuscripts, they became beautiful relics of a fading age, outshone by the bold ink of merchant contracts and the brisk pragmatism of a world moving on. Florence's streets in the 15th century hummed with a peculiar alchemy, where gold dust from coin presses mingled with the incense wafting from the Duomo steps. At the heart of this paradox stood the Medici, a family that didn't just navigate the tension between piety and profit, they weaponized it. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the dynasty's founder, began as a modest moneylender, but his real innovation wasn't financial, it was cultural. He grasped something radical for his time: art and banking could be two sides of the same florin. When his son Cosimo commissioned Fra Angelico to fresco the convent of San Marco, the scenes of Christ's humility were painted with pigments paid for by interest rates, a visual sermon funded by the very practice the Church condemned. The Medici playbook was masterful in its duality. They funneled profits into chapels where their likenesses knelt in stained glass beside saints, yet their bank's ledgers reveal cold calculations. A loan to the Pope at 25% interest might be followed by a donation to rebuild a basilica, a transaction that balanced spiritual credit with earthly gain. Even their patronage was strategic. By funding Michelangelo's early career, Lorenzo the Magnificent didn't just buy beauty, he bought influence. The artist's David, commissioned for Florence's public square, became a billboard for Medici taste and power, all while draped in the cloak of civic piety. Yet calling them mere hypocrites misses the nuance. The Medici lived the era's contradictions without apology. When Cosimo was exiled in 1433 for overweening ambition, he spent his banishment studying Plotho in Venice, then returned to build Florence's first public library. His grandson Lorenzo would host philosophical debates between priests and pagan scholars in one room, while his clerks next door foreclosed on delinquent debtors. This wasn't cognitive dissonance, it was a new worldview taking shape, one where material success and spiritual merit weren't opposites but partners. Their legacy crystallizes in the Medici chapel. Designed by Michelangelo, its marble saints and allegorical figures are breathtaking, but the true masterpiece lies beneath the floor. There, hidden from casual viewers, the family's account books were buried alongside their bones. It's the perfect metaphor. Even in death, they kept one hand on the ledger and the other on heaven's gate. Europe would never again see wealth and worship as entirely separate realms. The Medici proved money could buy more than luxury. It could purchase a seat at eternity's table. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, he wasn't just protesting indulgences. He was unwittingly drafting a new economic manifesto. His radical idea that a cobbler hammering shoes or a merchant tallying ledgers could serve God as devoutly as a monk chanting psalms. This wasn't just theology, it was a seismic shift in how Europe valued labor. Suddenly, the bustling marketplace wasn't a distraction from salvation. It was the very arena where faith proved itself. Calvin took it further. In Geneva, he preached that prosperity might signal God's favor, not as a reward for piety, but as proof of disciplined stewardship. Imagine the shockwaves this sent through a world where merchants had long been viewed with suspicion. Now, the same traits that made a good trader, thrift, diligence, punctuality, became marks of moral virtue. Calvinist sermons read like business manuals, urging followers to treat time as a sacred resource and waste as sin. Dutch merchants, many of them Calvinists, didn't just keep clocks to track shipments. They saw each ticking second as a gift from God to be invested, not squandered. The real innovation was psychological. Medieval monks earned grace through renunciation, but reformers offered something revolutionary. You could serve heaven without leaving your workshop. A weaver's loom became his pulpit, his prophets a measure of faithfulness. This spiritual rebranding of commerce had explosive consequences. When Lutheran princes secularized monastery lands, they didn't just redistribute wealth, they repurposed centuries of agricultural knowledge for market-driven farming. Cistercian granges, once devoted to self-sufficiency, now fed booming textile towns. Yet the Reformation's economic legacy was never straightforward. Luther railed against the Fuggers, Europe's wealthiest banking family, calling their interest rates devil's harvest. Calvin, though more pragmatic, still warned that wealth was a dangerous armor that could crush the soul if worn carelessly. The tension birthed a peculiar duality. Protestant cities like Amsterdam became engines of capitalism, even as their churches preached moderation. Merchant guilds commissioned altar pieces showing Jesus clearing the temple of Moneylenders, even as those same guilds funded the artwork with trade profits. What emerged was a new moral calculus, one that still shapes our world. The Protestant work ethic didn't just sanctify labor, it fused spiritual and economic ambition so completely that centuries later, we barely notice the seams. When a modern entrepreneur boasts of hustle culture, they're echoing Calvin's sermons on diligence. When we equate busyness with virtue, we're channeling Luther's vision of vocation. The Reformation's real disruption wasn't just in how people prayed, but in how they worked, and in that alchemy of faith and productivity, the soul of capitalism took its first breath. At the University of Paris in the 13th century, a peculiar sight unfolded daily. Tonsured theology students debating eternal salvation in one lecture hall while across the courtyard. Ambitious young men pored over Roman law texts, learning how to draft contracts and collect debts. This wasn't just an academic divide, It was the medieval mind split in two. Universities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford became battlegrounds where the monks' spiritual ideals collided with the merchants' pragmatic worldviews, shaping generations caught between heaven and ledger books. Bologna's law school embodied this tension perfectly. Founded by merchant guilds in the 11th century, it specialized in Justinian's Code, an ancient Roman legal system that treated property rights as sacred. Students memorized clauses on loan guarantees and inheritance, while Dominican friars at neighboring pulpits warned that no wealthy man shall enter heaven. Yet the irony was rich. Those same friars often hired Bologna's graduates to defend church lands in court. The curriculum itself reflected this duality. Canon law classes taught that charging interest was sinful, while civil law professors explained how to structure penalty fees that functioned identically to interest. Young scholars left with whiplash and a shrewd ability to navigate both moral and market economies. Paris took a different approach. Its theology faculty, dominated by Franciscans and Dominicans, treated commerce as a necessary evil. Thomas Aquinas's lectures on just price theory became required reading, arguing that traders shouldn't profit beyond a fair wage for their labor. But even here, reality crept in. When the university needed new dormitories, it quietly accepted donations from textile merchants who'd grown rich trading with Muslim Spain. The very classrooms where theologians condemned greed were built with profits from cross-cultural trade. Oxford's Merton College became an unexpected laboratory for this clash. Founded in 1264, it blended monastic discipline with cutting-edge mathematics. Its fellows, many from merchant families, developed compound interest calculations while also copying patristic manuscripts. The Merton calculators, as they were called, didn't see piety and profit as opposites. To them, God had created a universe of precise ratios, whether in planetary orbits or loan repayments. Their work laid foundations for both modern physics and double-entry bookkeeping, proof that the same mind could measure celestial and earthly value, the real winners of this academic tug of war. The students themselves. A graduate might spend mornings parsing Augustine's City of God and afternoons mastering maritime insurance law. This hybrid education created a new breed of leaders: bishops who understood mortgage contracts, burgomasters who quoted Aristotle on civic virtue. When the Black Death emptied classrooms, it was these multilingual, legally savvy graduates who rebuilt Europe's institutions, applying scholastic logic to tax reforms and epidemic quarantines alike. The lecture hall's legacy endures in modern dilemmas. Every time we debate whether business ethics courses belong in universities or argue over how much STEM curricula should cost, we're replaying the medieval clash between Cluny and the counting house. The parchment may have given way to laptops, but the essential question remains: can education serve both the soul and the marketplace without betraying either? The answer, as those old universities discovered, lies not in choosing sides but in holding the tension and letting it spark something new. The quiet power of medieval women often unfolded in the shadows of cloisters and counting houses, but make no mistake, their influence shaped the battle between monks and merchants as profoundly as any papal decree or trade contract. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose visions commanded the attention of emperors and popes. While monks debated theology in Latin, she composed music and medical treatises, turning her Rhineland convent into a hub of intellectual exchange. Yet even her spiritual authority depended on delicate negotiations with local merchants for wax, parchment, and wine, a reminder that holiness couldn't escape the marketplace. For every Hildegard, there were dozens of lesser-known women threading the needle between piety and profit. Consider the Beguines, lay women who formed spiritual communes without taking monastic vows. In cities like Bruges and Cologne, they supported themselves by weaving fine cloth or brewing ale, their workshops adjacent to chapels where they prayed. Neither fully cloistered nor wholly secular, they embodied the era's contradictions, devout yet economically independent, answering to neither abbots nor husbands. When church authorities grew suspicious of their autonomy, it wasn't just their spirituality under scrutiny, it was their financial self-sufficiency that threatened the established order. Merchant-class women wielded a different kind of leverage. Under laws like the Femmes Sole statutes in London and Frankfurt, a widow could inherit her husband's trade rights and debts. Names like Margherita d'Attini, wife of a 14th-century Tuscan merchant, pepper the ledgers of European commerce. After her husband's death, she ran their textile empire with such precision that her account books became models for male competitors. Her letters reveal the tightrope walk. She donated lavishly to Franciscan friars while driving hard bargains with Florentine dyers. The church might frown at her profits, but her alms bought quiet acceptance. Even peasant women played strategic roles. In rural Cistercian granges, abbesses supervised female laborers who spun wool destined for Flemish markets. Those same women might sell surplus eggs or herbs at town fairs, their small-scale trade funneling cash back into monastic coffers. Their dual identity, as both pious workers and petty capitalists, exposed the hypocrisy of a system that relied on their labor while preaching female subservience. The real battleground was inheritance. When a wealthy merchant's daughter entered a convent, her dowry wasn't just spiritual. It was a transfer of capital from the commercial world to the ecclesiastical. Families like the Medicis strategically placed daughters as abbesses, turning convents into extensions of their financial networks. Meanwhile, merchant widows who resisted remarriage could control fortunes rivaling small kingdoms. Jacqueline of Bavaria, Countess of Holland, famously used her wealth to play monks and merchants against each other, funding church renovations while underwriting Baltic trade voyages. These women's stories reveal a startling truth. The conflict between sacred and secular wasn't just fought in cathedrals and guild halls. It was negotiated in convent parlors and market stalls, through the quiet calculus of dowries and donations, cloth production and clandestine loans. Their legacy lingers in the paradoxes we still grapple with today. Can ambition be holy? Can service be self-interested? In their ability to inhabit both worlds without apology, medieval women wrote a forgotten chapter in the struggle for Europe's soul, one stitch, one coin, one prayer at a time. The road to Canterbury wasn't just a path to penance, it was a medieval superhighway buzzing with commerce. Picture a band of pilgrims trudging toward Thomas Becket's shrine, their robes dusted with dirt, passing peddlers hawking scallop shell badges from Santiago, spice merchants from Venice, and Flemish cloth traders. These routes, carved by faith, became veins pumping goods and gold across Europe. A pilgrim might set out to atone for sins, but he'd return with silk for his wife, exotic spices for his table, and maybe a few indulgences sold by entrepreneurial friars at roadside stalls. The sacred and the mercantile didn't just share the road, they leaned on each other like weary travelers swapping stories at an inn. Take the Camino de Santiago. What began as a spiritual journey to the Apostle James's relics in Compostela transformed into an economic engine. Hospices sprung up every 20 kilometers, not just to shelter pilgrims, but to sell them food, wine, and forged relics. Enterprising locals sold lead medallions stamped with the scallop shell, convincing travelers these trinkets carried divine blessings. By the 12th century, Compostela's cathedral employed its own money changers, converting coins from a dozen kingdoms into offerings for the saint's altar. Even the routes themselves were shaped by profit. detours to wealthy abbeys where monks charged tolls, or through towns like Burgos, where merchants paid to redirect pilgrim traffic past their shops. The Canterbury Tales captures this duality perfectly. Chaucer's miller and merchant rubbed shoulders with the parson and nun, their tales blurring piety with worldly wit. The wife of Bath, a clothier, brags of her pilgrimages to Rome and Boulogne, less for devotion than for the thrill of travel and trade. Real-life records confirm this overlap. London grocers' ledgers list wax candles sold to pilgrims for votive offerings alongside shipments of saffron and pepper. A Genoese sailor might vow to walk to Compostela if St. James spared his ship, then use the journey to negotiate contracts for next season's wool. The Church's response was a masterclass in pragmatic spirituality. Monasteries along pilgrimage routes didn't just offer beds, they sold relics guaranteed to heal ailments or shorten purgatory stays. The Abbey of Conques in France displayed its golden statue of Saint Foy, claiming it could free prisoners, conveniently located near a major silver mine where the abbey held interests. Critics like Bernard of Clairvaux railed against the golden idols, but even Bernard's Cistercians profited indirectly, their sheep farms supplying wool for the cloaks pilgrims bought to brave mountain passes. This symbiosis reshaped Europe's landscape. Bridges built for pilgrims like the Pont d'Avignon became vital trade crossings. Inns that started as humble shelters evolved into banking hubs where letters of credit could be exchanged. The very concept of travel shifted. Pilgrimage handbooks like the 12th century Liber Sancti Jacobi mixed spiritual advice with practical tips on avoiding bandits and finding honest money changers, a medieval lonely planet for the soul-searching tourist. Yet the tension never disappeared. When Dominican preachers thundered against merchants exploiting pilgrims, they weren't wrong. Fake relics flooded markets, alleged splinters of the true cross so plentiful. Erasmus joked they could rebuild Noah's Ark. But the deeper truth was this: the roads to salvation were paved with more than good intentions. They were built on a messy, vibrant collision of faith and commerce that turned Europe into a continent where the sacred and the profane didn't just coexist, they thrived by sharing the same winding path. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, his vision was pure and fiery, a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from infidels. What he didn't foresee was the army of merchants trailing behind the knights, their wagons groaning with supplies and their eyes gleaming with opportunity. The Crusades, it turned out, ran not just on faith but on flour sacks, horseshoes, and Venetian silver. A knight's vow to take the cross might pledge poverty, but his sword belt still needed repairs, his men required ale, and someone had to ferry them across the Mediterranean. That someone was always a merchant, often the same Italian traders the Church had condemned for charging interest just years earlier. Venice alone became a crusading powerhouse not through piety but through contracts. When the Fourth Crusade stalled in 1202 for lack of ships, Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo made an offer. His city would build and crew a fleet for 85,000 silver marks and half the spoils of conquest. The result: Crusaders sacked Christian Constantinople instead of Jerusalem, shipping its looted treasures back to Venice, where they still adorn St. Mark's Basilica. The lesson was clear: holy wars needed bankers as much as bishops, but the real economic shockwave came from what returned with the Crusaders. Knights who'd marched east to purge luxury discovered apricots in Damascus, silks in Antioch, and sugar, previously a rare medicinal powder, now piled in market squares. Templar knights sworn to poverty became Europe's first multinational bankers by safeguarding pilgrims' wealth in a network stretching from London to Jerusalem. Their ledgers recorded deposits in one city, withdrawals in another, a system so efficient that French kings borrowed from them while condemning their wealth. The church's discomfort was palpable. Sugar, once a monastic remedy, now sweetened noble banquets. Islamic astrolabes brought back as curiosities, revolutionized European navigation. Even the humble compass likely encountered during Crusades made merchants less reliant on divine guidance for voyages. With each returning ship, the line between holy war and trade mission blurred further. When Genoese merchants established trade colonies in Crusader states, they weren't just supplying the faithful, they were undercutting Byzantine middlemen to dominate the spice trade. By the time the Crusades sputtered out, their legacy wasn't just in reclaimed holy sites, but in reshaped tastes and economies. Italian city-states, enriched by transporting crusaders, now had the wealth to fund Renaissance art. Northern European towns, once peripheral, grew rich supplying wool for crusader uniforms. The ultimate irony, the same church that launched holy wars to cleanse Europe of worldly distractions had inadvertently unleashed an appetite for luxury goods that would make merchants the new princes of the age. The Crusaders' real conquest wasn't territory, it was Europe's palate and pocketbook, forever altered by the very commerce their wars were meant to transcend. The champagne fairs of medieval France began each morning with a mass priests chanting over bales of Flemish wool and barrels of Italian wine before the trading commenced. This wasn't just lip service to piety, it was a ritual as vital as the weighing of coins. Merchants knelt for blessings, then haggled with one eye on the heavens and the other on their ledgers. The fair's very layout mirrored this duality. The cloth market sprawled beside the cathedral, the money changers' tables a stone's throw from the confessional booths. For a few weeks each year, towns like Troyes and Provence became stages where spiritual and commercial dramas unfolded in tandem. What made these fairs extraordinary wasn't their size, though they drew traders from Genoa to Bruges, but their alchemy of contradictions. A merchant might swear an oath on saintly relics to honor a contract, then pivot to selling those same relics as souvenirs. The Cistercians, those austere monks who shunned luxury, became unlikely fairgoers, their wool the most sought-after commodity in the market. Even the timing was strategic. Fairs coincided with feast days, ensuring crowds for both the vendors and the votive candle sellers. The genius lay in the rules. Church courts settled disputes under canon law, but their judgments often deferred to merchant customs. A defaulted debt might earn a trader excommunication, yet the same bishop pronouncing the ban would quietly negotiate its lifting for a donation to the local shrine. The fair's currency itself carried sacred echoes, silver pennies stamped with crosses as if to sanctify the very act of exchange. Yet for all their harmony, tensions simmered. Preachers like Jacques de Vitry thundered against the devil's bargains struck in the shadow of chapels. One notorious incident in 1234 saw a group of merchants drag a rival before a statue of the Virgin Mary to settle a dispute, only to brawl when the verdict went against them, splintering the altar rail. The church's response: impose heavier fines for such sacrilege, then use the proceeds to gild the cathedral's doors. The fair's ultimate legacy was this: they proved spirituality and commerce didn't have to conquer each other, they could dance. When a Venetian glassblower traded beads for English wool, both parties walked away richer in coin and conscience, having tithed a portion to the local abbey. When a ledger from 1280 surfaced in Provence, its pages alternated between sales records and prayers for dead business partners. Even the fair's decline carried poetic symmetry. As banking houses replaced seasonal markets, the last fairmasters donated their scales to be melted into church bells. Commerce literally transformed into sacred music. These gatherings left behind more than trade routes. They offered medieval Europe a glimpse of an uncomfortable truth. The sacred and profane weren't separate realms to be balanced, but threads in the same tapestry. A merchant's vow sworn on relics held not because the objects were holy, but because the marketplace had its own sanctity, one built on trust as much as terror of hellfire. The Champagne fairs didn't just move goods, they quietly rewrote the rules of what it meant to be both devout and ambitious in a world where the road to heaven was paved with more than good intentions. By the time the Renaissance dawned, Europe's ledger books told a quiet revolution merchants no longer knelt at the feet of monks for moral approval. The marketplace had its own sacraments now, contracts sealed with wax instead of blessings, profit margins measured like psalms. Yet for all its triumph, capitalism's victory was never absolute. The ghost of monastic ideals haunted counting houses and stock exchanges, whispering that wealth without conscience was just gilded emptiness. This tension didn't just shape economies, it forged the moral compass we still use today. Take the Fugger family of Augsburg, bankers who funded emperors and popes. Jakob Fugger the Younger amassed a fortune so vast he loaned Charles V the money to bribe his way to the Holy Roman Emperor's throne. Yet on his deathbed in 1525, he commissioned the Fuggeray, the world's first social housing complex, where poor Catholics could rent a home for a single Rhine gulden per year. The same man who charged interest to princes built a city within a city where the destitute paid less than market rate. Was this hypocrisy or a new kind of holiness? The Fugger's story captures the Renaissance's central paradox. Money could be both engine and idol, and Europe hadn't decided which. Critics emerged from the cloister's shadow. Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, depicted an imaginary island where gold was used to make chamber pots, a direct jab at merchant princes who conflated wealth with worth. Erasmus mocked financiers who tithed with one hand and shortchanged with the other. Even Machiavelli, no stranger to pragmatism, warned in The Prince that money alone couldn't buy loyalty. These weren't fringe voices, they were bestsellers, proof that monastic values had evolved into humanist critiques of unchecked commerce. Yet the real legacy of this battle lies in the systems it birthed. The joint stock company, invented to spread the risks of spice voyages, borrowed its structure from monastic brotherhoods' shared purpose, pooled resources. Early insurance contracts mimicked the way monasteries distributed alms to the needy. Even the modern corporation's legal personhood echoes medieval theology's concept of the church as a mystical body. The tools of capitalism were secular, but their design bore the fingerprints of spiritual community. This duality still pulses through our financial dilemmas. Every time we debate CEO salaries versus worker wages, or argue whether ethical investing dilutes profits, we're replaying the medieval quarrel in modern terms. The past whispers in today's boardrooms, can a market be free if it's not also fair? Does growth require ghosts, those old monastic ideals, to haunt its halls? The answer, as the Renaissance discovered, isn't choosing between wealth and virtue, but holding both in tension, letting each correct the other's excesses, just as merchant pragmatism once tempered monastic austerity, and vice versa. The balance remains as delicate and as vital as it was when the first Medici banker glanced uneasily at a crucifix while tallying his florins. Walk into any Silicon Valley startup today, and you'll find meditation pods next to revenue dashboards, tech moguls chasing enlightenment between funding rounds. This isn't just a trendy contradiction. It's the latest chapter in a story that began with monks copying manuscripts while merchants minted coins outside their walls. Our modern obsession with work-life balance and ethical capitalism echoes the medieval struggle to reconcile spiritual depth with material success. But history whispers a provocative truth. We haven't so much solved this tension as dressed it in new robes. Take the wellness industry, a $20 trillion global behemoth that sells serenity like a commodity. Yoga studios offer corporate packages to hedge funds. Mindfulness apps tout productivity boosts alongside inner peace. It's eerily reminiscent of medieval indulgence sellers, except now, instead of purchasing reduced time in purgatory, executives pay for reduced stress. Even the language overlaps. Monks spoke of detachment, while modern gurus preach digital detox. The tools have changed, but the underlying hunger remains, a longing to enjoy prosperity without being consumed by it. On Wall Street, the parallels run deeper. Modern financial instruments like ESG investing, where portfolios are screened for environmental and social responsibility, mirror the medieval church's just price doctrine. Both attempt to impose ethical guardrails on markets prone to excess. The Medici would nod in recognition at today's billionaire philanthropists who funnel tech profits into climate initiatives or global health, not so different from merchant princes funding cathedrals to atone for usury. The mechanisms are more sophisticated, but the dance between guilt and generosity hasn't changed. Yet there's a crucial difference. Medieval monks and merchants at least agreed on a shared moral framework, whether they followed it or not. Today, our secular world lacks that common language. When a CEO cites shareholder value to justify layoffs, or an influencer sells soulful branding workshops, we're left without a lingua franca to debate what truly balances profit and purpose. This vacuum fuels our pendulum swings from 80s greed to mindfulness mania, from burnout culture to quiet quitting. History offers an unexpected clue in the Franciscan friars, who ministered in marketplaces rather than cloisters. They didn't reject commerce, they sought to sanctify it from within. Modern parallels exist in companies like Patagonia, where profit funds environmental activism, or the B Corp movement, where businesses legally bind themselves to social good. These aren't perfect solutions, but they reflect the same pragmatic idealism that once let a merchant donate a stained glass window depicting St. Nicholas counting coins, a visual prayer for holiness in the hustle. Perhaps the real lesson lies in recognizing that this tension isn't a problem to solve, but a dynamic to navigate. The monks and merchants of medieval Europe didn't find a perfect equilibrium, but their friction generated light as well as heat. Universities, hospitals, even the concept of fair trade. Our task isn't to choose between spiritual and material worlds, but to build bridges sturdy enough to walk between them without losing ourselves. After all, the illuminated manuscripts and the ledger books were often made from the same parchment, just turned to different pages in the story of what it means to be human. The battle between monks and merchants wasn't just a medieval footnote, it was the crucible that forged the modern world. Think of it like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of history, their friction pushing up mountains and carving valleys we still walk through today. Every time you check your bank balance or pause to consider work-life balance, you're stepping into footprints left by those robed idealists and sharp-eyed traders. Their struggle wasn't about who won, but about how their collision created something neither could have imagined alone. Consider the humble clock. Monks invented mechanical timekeepers to structure their prayer hours, dividing the day into sacred rhythms. Merchants then claimed those gears for commerce, turning time into shifts and deadlines. Now, your smartwatch buzzes with reminders for meetings and meditation apps, a perfect fusion of spiritual discipline and capitalist efficiency. Even our language betrays this heritage. Mortgage comes from the French for death pledge, a term coined when the church reluctantly accepted property as loan collateral. Company derives from the Latin compagno, breaking bread together, just as monastic brothers did. These aren't just etymological curiosities, they're fossils of an ancient tension embedded in our daily lives. The most telling legacy lies in our divided hearts, like a medieval merchant donating to a cathedral while haggling over silk prices. We toggle between idealism and pragmatism. Silicon Valley billionaires fund space exploration and mindfulness retreats, mirroring the Medici's twin passions for banking and Botticelli. Our environmental movements preach austerity with the fervor of Franciscan friars, while gig economy apps echo the Hanseatic League's ruthless efficiency. The battle didn't end, it just upgraded its weapons from quills and ledgers to algorithms and ESG metrics. So where does that leave us? Not choosing sides, but recognizing that both impulses, the monk's call to meaning and the merchant's drive for progress, are essential. The monasteries taught us that community and contemplation matter. The marketplaces showed how innovation lifts societies. Perhaps the real lesson is that civilization thrives not when one side conquers, but when they dance in uneasy partnership. Next time you wrestle with a moral dilemma at work or feel torn between ambition and peace, remember, you're inheriting an 800-year-old conversation. The good news: we get to write the next chapter. If history's hidden crossroads fascinate you, join us as we keep uncovering them. Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments, how do you balance soul and spreadsheet in your daily life?